The tin rattle scraped Colt Harland's boot, metal tapping leather in a weak rhythm. Click. Drag. Click. A cracked cavalry whistle knocking against his spur. He tried stepping past. A hand caught his coat hem and held fast. The woman knelt in the ranch dust, breath thin, eyes stubborn. Her other hand pressed the dented whistle toward his bomb. Air wheezed through it, a thin broken note that refused to carry. Colt hardened his voice. "There is no room here." The woman lifted her shawl with shaking fingers. Beneath it, a child moved. And the whistle rasped once more against his boot. Wind pushed dust along the empty yard, whispering across broken fence posts and dry grass. The ranch house stood alone against the pale horizon. One window. One lantern. One man inside who rarely spoke. Colt Harland sat at the rough table sharpening a blade that did not need sharpening. Steel scraped stone. Slow. Patient. The sound filled the quiet like a stubborn heartbeat. Outside, the wind rattled the loose porch board. Tap. Pause. Tap again. Colt did not look up. Most sounds out here meant nothing. Coyotes brushing past the barn. Branches scratching dry wood. The world knocking on doors that stayed closed. He dragged the wet stone once more across the knife. Steel rasped. The blade caught the lantern light. Sharp enough. Always sharp enough. The wind shifted. A different sound now. Metal touching leather. Click. Drag. Click. Colt's hand stopped mid-stroke. The sound came again from the porch boards. Click. Drag. Click. Something small. Something broken. He set the knife down slowly. The chair legs groaned against the plank floor as he stood. Outside, the lantern glow stretched thin through the doorway crack. Dust moved like pale smoke in the wind. Colt opened the door. Cold air pushed against his chest. The porch board creaked beneath his boot. Nothing at first. Just empty land and long shadows. Then the sound again. Click. Drag. Click. Colt looked down. A woman knelt in the dirt beside the step. One hand gripping the hem of his coat like it was the last rope in a flood. Her fingers trembled but would not let go. Dust clung to her skin. Her breath came shallow and uneven. Against Colt's boot, something small knocked again. A dented cavalry whistle hung from a thin cord around her wrist. Its cracked mouthpiece scraped his spur. Click. Drag. Click. The wind tugged at her shawl. Her eyes lifted toward him. Dark. Stubborn. Tired beyond words. Colt's jaw hardened. This ain't a boarding house. His coat tugged again as her grip tightened. She tried to speak. The word broke apart before it reached the air. Her hand lifted the whistle toward him. When she pushed breath through it, the sound came thin and broken. A weak wheeze that barely traveled past the porch rail. Colt stared at the dented metal. Cavalry markings scratched along the side. Old. Older than the woman kneeling in his dust. The wind pulled her shawl aside. Her free hand rested over the curve of her stomach. Not subtle. Not mistaken. Colt exhaled slowly through his nose. The empty yard stretched behind him. Silent. Cold. Unforgiving. The whistle tapped his boot again. Click. Drag. Click. He muttered under his breath. Damn it. Colt stepped aside and pushed the door wider. The hinges groaned as the warm lantern light spilled across the porch. Get inside. The woman tried to stand. Her knees buckled. Colt caught her before she hit the boards. She weighed almost nothing. Dust and bone and stubborn breath. The whistle brushed his coat as he lifted her. Inside, the floorboards creaked beneath his boots. The door shut behind them with a heavy wooden thud. Outside, the wind kept whispering over the empty ranch. Inside, the broken whistle gave one soft rasp as the woman crossed the threshold into the house. The fire cracked low in the iron stove. Dry pine snapped. Warm light crawled across the cabin walls. Colt Harland stood near the door, arms folded, watching the woman sit where he had set her. She stayed close to the heat. Boots dusty. Shawl pulled tight. The dented cavalry whistle rested in her palm. Its thin cord looped around her wrist like it belonged there. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind brushed the outside walls. Cold fingers scratching wood. Inside, the fire breathed slow warmth. Colt finally pushed a dented tin cup across the table. "Drink." The woman took it carefully. Her hands trembled. Steam lifted from the coffee in thin ribbons. She swallowed once. Then again. Color crept slowly back into her face. The whistle bumped softly against the table. Click. Colt heard it. His eyes moved to the small metal piece. Dented. Cracked mouthpiece. Cavalry etching worn thin. Name. The woman wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Elena. Her voice came quiet but steady. Colt nodded once. Nothing more. Silence settled again. The cabin breathed in small sounds. Fire popping. Chair legs shifting. Coffee cooling. Elena held the cup near her chest, letting the heat sink in. Outside the wind rose. A cold whistle in the distance. Colt glanced toward the door without moving. Elena followed the motion. "You live alone?" "Not a question." Colt shrugged. "Works fine." Her eyes drifted around the cabin. One bed. One chair. One saddle hung on the wall. Empty hooks where other things once lived. Her gaze returned to him. "You don't like visitors?" "No." The whistle tapped the wood again when she set it down. Click. Colt's jaw tightened slightly. He reached out. Turned the whistle with 2 fingers. The metal scraped the table. "Where'd you get this?" Elena's hand moved quickly. She took it back. Held it close to her chest. Her shoulders stiffened. "Just something I carry." Colt watched her for a long second. Then he leaned back. "Didn't ask what it means." Another silence. Fire popped. Wind brushed the chimney pipe. Elena stared into the flames. The warmth softened her shoulders a little. "My horse died 2 miles back." Colt didn't respond. "I walked the rest." He glanced down at her boots. Dust packed deep into the seams. Heel worn thin. "How far you come?" "Far enough." Colt grunted quietly. He stood. Crossed the room. Pulled a thick wool blanket from a peg. Dropped it beside her. "Storm coming tonight." Elena nodded slowly. Her fingers brushed the blanket. Warm. Heavy. Real. The wind outside shifted. Something loose in the yard clattered. Metal against wood. Colt turned his head sharply. Listened. The sound stopped. Just wind again. Elena noticed the change in him. "You expecting someone?" "No." The answer came too fast. He stepped to the window. Pushed the curtain aside. Dark ranch land stretched under a pale moon. Fence line crooked. Barn quiet. Nothing moving. Still. Too still. Colt let the curtain fall. The fire cracked again. Warm air pressed gently against the cold creeping through the walls. Elena shifted in her chair. Her hand moved slowly to her stomach. The gesture small. Protective. Colt noticed. Said nothing. Instead he walked to the stove. Pulled a small pot from the side. Beans. Cold. He set them near the heat. "You can have the bed." Elena shook her head. "I'll take the chair." "You'll take the bed." His voice firm. Not loud. Just settled. She studied him. Trying to understand the man standing across the small room. "You don't know me." "No." "You still let me stay." Colt stirred the beans once. Steam began to rise. "You're cold." That's not the only reason. He stopped stirring. Looked at her. You got another one. Elena held the whistle tighter. Its cord tightened around her wrist. Metal clicked softly against the cup. The fire popped louder. Outside, the wind carried a faint sound across the ranch. Distant. Barely there. Hooves. Colt's head lifted. He listened. One breath. Two. The sound faded again into the wind. Maybe nothing. Maybe riders miles away. But the quiet inside the cabin changed. The warmth felt thinner. The firelight smaller. Elena noticed the shift. Someone looking for me. Colt didn't ask. He moved to the door. Checked the latch. Solid. Then he crossed to the rifle leaning against the wall. He lifted it. Checked the chamber. Steel clicked softly. Set it beside the table. The sound filled the cabin like a promise. Elena watched him. You don't have to do this. Colt sat down slowly. The chair creaked under his weight. Didn't say I was. Silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Now it carried weight. Fire warmth on one side. Cold wind pressing the walls. The whistle rested between them on the table. Its dented surface catching the lantern glow. Elena reached for it again. Held it in both hands. Her thumb traced the faint cavalry marking. She didn't realize she was breathing through it. A soft wheeze slipped out. Thin. Broken. Almost like a child learning to speak. Colt looked at the whistle. Then at her. Then at the door. Outside, the wind rolled across the empty ranch. Somewhere far away. A faint horse snorted into the night. The fire cracked louder. Inside the cabin, the warmth held. For now. Morning crept slow through the frost on the window. Thin light. Pale as watered milk. The fire in the stove had burned down to quiet red coals. Warmth still lived in the room. Barely. Colt Harland woke in the chair with a stiff neck and a hand resting near the rifle. The cabin breathed soft morning sounds. Wood settling. Wind brushing the roof. Someone moving quietly across the floor. He opened one eye. Elena stood near the stove. The blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. She stirred the pot of beans with slow, careful motions. The spoon tapped the iron edge. Soft. Rhythmic. Colt watched without speaking. Steam rose from the pot. Warm. Real. The smell filled the small cabin. Elena noticed him awake. Morning. Her voice came softer than yesterday. Colt grunted. You should be in bed. I slept enough. The spoon scraped again. He pushed himself up from the chair. Bones popping. Boots thudding quietly across the floor. Cold still lived in the boards. The stove door creaked open as he fed two small logs into the coals. Flames licked up again. Light returned to the room. Elena handed him a tin bowl. Eat. Colt looked at it. You cooked. You had food. He sat down slowly. Tasted the beans. Hot. Simple. Good. The whistle rested beside her bowl on the table. The dented metal caught the firelight. When she shifted her arm, it knocked softly against the wood. Click. Colt glanced at it again. Always that sound. Always that little broken rattle. Outside, the wind had quieted. Just a faint whisper through the grass. He stepped to the window. Frost lined the edges of the glass. The ranch yard stretched empty. Barn door half open. Fence leaning crooked toward the hills. No riders. No movement. Still. Too still. He turned back. Elena had moved the chair aside. She stood near the wall now. Folding the blanket. Slow, careful motions. You don't have to do that. Her eyes lifted. I'm not dead. Colt didn't answer. She hung the blanket neatly over the chair. Then her hand pressed gently against the small of her back. Just a moment. A quiet ache. She thought he didn't see. He did. You should rest. I will. But she didn't. Instead she reached for a rag and wiped the table. The cloth brushed the wood. Soft. Quiet. The whistle rolled slightly under her hand. Click. Colt picked it up before it fell. Turned it slowly in his fingers. The dent ran along the side like a scar. The cavalry mark scratched shallow but still there. Old. Government issue. His thumb rubbed the engraving. Union issue. Elena froze. Only for a second. You recognize it. Used one once. He lifted it slightly. Light struck the cracked mouthpiece. Signal whistle. For cavalry patrols. Her hand reached out slowly. He let her take it. You were a soldier. Long time ago. War? After. The whistle rested between her palms now. She looked down at it. Then away. Colt leaned back in the chair. Where'd you get it? Silence. The stove popped loudly. A log shifted. Elena moved to the window. Looked out across the ranch land. Some things follow you. That ain't an answer. No. But it was all she gave. The silence stretched again. Thicker now. Outside the wind carried a faint sound across the valley. Far. But real. Colt heard it first. A horse. Distant hooves striking hard ground. He moved to the window again. Listened. The sound faded. Maybe miles away. Maybe not. Elena turned slowly. You heard it. Colt didn't lie. Yeah. Her hand tightened around the whistle. The cord wrapped twice around her wrist now. A small instinct. Hold tight. Don't lose it. Could be travelers. Could be. But neither of them believed it. The ranch sat far from any trail. Riders didn't pass here by accident. Colt stepped outside. Cold morning air hit his lungs. Sharp. Clean. The yard stretched quiet. Fence creaking gently. Barn door swinging once. He scanned the hills. Nothing. But something had been there. The ground told stories. Even when eyes couldn't. A faint line in the dust near the gate. Fresh. Boot heel. Horse track. Not old. Not yesterday. This morning. Colt crouched low. Studied it. 2 horses. Maybe 3. Riding slow. Watching. The wind brushed the grass again. Soft whisper across the land. Colt stood. His jaw tightened. Inside the cabin Elena waited near the stove. The warmth wrapped around her again. But her eyes had changed. She could see the answer on his face. Someone came. Yeah. Did they stop? No. Her breath eased slightly. But not fully. The whistle tapped softly against the table when she set it down. Click. Colt looked at the sound. Then at her. They'll come back. Elena didn't argue. Didn't ask who. She already knew the truth living behind that small metal whistle. Outside the wind began to rise again. Inside the fire burned brighter. Warmth pushing against the cold. But both of them understood something now. The ranch was no longer empty. And the quiet would not last. Snow began before noon. First a few pale flakes drifting across the gray sky. Then more. Cold dust falling without hurry. Colt Harland stood beneath the barn awning, watching the pasture disappear beneath the white fence posts fading. Hills turning soft and pale. Winter closing the door on the world. Behind him the barn horse stamped once. Leather creaked as the saddle shifted on its hook. Quiet ranch sounds. Familiar. Safe. Inside the house a small iron pan struck the stove. Clink. Colt glanced back toward the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney. thin. Steady. Warmth fighting the cold outside. He walked across the yard. Boots crunching frozen dirt. Wind pushing snow against his coat. The porch board groaned when he stepped up. Inside the cabin the warmth hit him first. Fire breathing steady heat. Beans simmering. The smell of coffee. Elena stood near the stove again. Blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. One hand resting on the table for balance. The other stirring a pot slowly. Steam rose into the quiet room. The whistle rested beside the bowl. Its cord looped neatly now. When the spoon struck the pot edge, the whistle rattled once. Click. Elena looked up. "You left before breakfast." Colt shrugged off the cold. "Needed to see the sky." She glanced toward the window. "Snow thick now." "We're snowed in." "For a bit." The wind pressed against the walls. Cold whisper outside. Inside the fire cracked loudly. A warm pocket of life. Colt set a small bundle of firewood beside the stove. Elena watched him. "You could have sent me away yesterday." "Storm coming." "That wasn't the reason." Colt didn't answer. He poured coffee into a tin cup. Steam fogged the air between them. Elena lowered herself slowly into the chair. The movement careful. Measured. The chair creaked under her weight. The whistle rolled slightly across the table. Click. Colt reached out and stopped it. His fingers turned the metal again. He had cleaned some of the dirt away. The cavalry stamp clearer now. Crossed sabers. Government issue. Old patrol whistle. War surplus. Elena said nothing. Colt studied the crack running through the mouthpiece. Someone stepped on it. Maybe. Or someone tried to silence it. Her eyes lifted slowly. Cold truth sat there. Quiet. The stove popped sharply. A log split under the heat. Elena looked back at the fire. "I didn't come here to bring trouble." Colt leaned back in the chair. "You didn't have to." The wind rose outside. Snow brushed hard against the window. A faint hollow sound echoed across the valley. Distant. Hard to place. Colt's head tilted slightly. Listening. The sound faded again. Just wind. Just winter. But he knew better. Elena saw it in his face. "You hear them again?" "Maybe." Her hand moved to the whistle. Not lifting it. Just touching the cord. The metal warmed slowly under her fingers. "You ever use one of those?" Colt nodded once. Signal patrols across distance. 3 short blasts meant danger. And 1 long. Call for help. Her fingers tightened around the whistle. "But this one don't work right." Colt leaned forward. Took it gently from her hand. Lifted it to his lips. Blew. The sound came thin. A broken wheeze. Weak. Not strong enough to carry far. But the shape of the note still there. He lowered it slowly. Enough for someone close. Elena watched him. "You think they heard it before?" "I think someone did." Silence returned. Thicker now. The storm outside grew louder. Snow tapping against the window. Wind rattling the loose board on the porch. Tap. Pause. Tap again. Elena flinched slightly. Colt stood and crossed the room. Opened the door. Cold air rushed inside. Snow swirled across the porch. The loose board lifted and dropped in the wind. Tap. Nothing else. No riders. No shapes moving through the storm. Colt closed the door again. The latch clicked. Warmth slowly returned to the room. Elena exhaled quietly. "You see anyone?" "No." "But..." He didn't finish. The fire cracked again. Colt added another log. Flames jumped higher. Light pushed the shadows back. Elena watched the fire for a long moment. "You ever regret staying here alone?" Colt stared into the flames. Peace don't live near people. That true? Most times. She rested her hands over her stomach again. The movement slower today. Heavy. Snow fell harder outside. The ranch disappearing behind the white curtain. The world shrinking to the small cabin. Firelight flickered across the walls. Warm. Quiet. Elena shifted slightly. Winced. Just a little. Colt noticed. You hurt? I'm fine. You're lying. She smiled faintly. Maybe a little. He pushed the chair closer to the stove. Stay warm. The whistle rested between them again. Its metal glowing faintly in the firelight. Outside the storm roared louder now. Wind and snow swallowing the valley. Inside the cabin the fire held. Warmth against the cold. Silence against the noise. But far beyond the storm. Somewhere out there. Men still rode. And both of them knew. Winter would not hide them forever. The storm broke sometime before dawn. Snow still covered the yard, but the wind had gone quiet. The ranch lay under a white hush. Fence posts buried halfway. Barn roof heavy with frost. Smoke rose thin from the cabin chimney. Inside, the stove burned steady. Warmth held the room like a blanket. Elena sat near the fire. A kettle murmured softly on the iron lid. Steam curled through the air. Her hands rested around a cup of coffee. Both palms cradling the heat. The dented cavalry whistle lay on the table beside her. Its metal warmed by the firelight. Click. It tapped softly when the kettle shifted. Colt Harland stood at the window. Watching the snowfield. The ranch looked peaceful. Too peaceful. The kind of quiet that made a man uneasy. He stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned beneath his weight. Cold air pressed against his lungs. Sharp. Clean. The snow held tracks. Fresh ones. 2 horses had come through the gate. Not hours ago. Minutes. Boot prints in the powder. Colt crouched low. His fingers brushed the edges of the track. Still soft. Still falling inward. Someone had ridden here this morning. Watched the house. Then turned away. He stood slowly. The valley lay silent. But the silence had changed. Colt walked back inside. The door shut with a heavy wooden thud. Elena looked up. You see something? Colt brushed snow from his coat. Riders came by. Her hand tightened around the cup. How many? 2. Did they stop? No. But his voice carried weight. They would. Soon. The stove popped loudly. A small burst of sparks jumped behind the iron grate. Warmth pressed against the cold creeping through the walls. Elena looked toward the whistle. Her fingers hovered above it. Then pulled back. I didn't mean to bring this to your door. Colt poured coffee. Steam rose between them. You didn't. Her eyes lifted. You sure about that? Colt didn't answer. Outside, somewhere far across the valley, a horse whinnied. Faint. Barely carried on the cold air. Elena heard it too. The cup rattled slightly in her hand. Colt stepped to the window again. 2 shapes moved slowly along the far ridge. Riders. Black silhouettes against the snow. Watching. Waiting. The men did not approach. Not yet. They turned their horses after a moment. Rode back toward the hills. But the message had been delivered. They knew where she was. Colt stepped away from the window. The fire crackled louder now. The warmth suddenly felt smaller. Elena's voice came low. They found me. Colt nodded once. The whistle rolled slightly across the table. Click. He stopped it with one finger. Who? Elena looked into the fire. The flames danced in her eyes. Men who don't like witnesses. Colt leaned back against the wall. You killed someone. No. You saw something. Her silence answered. Outside, the snow shifted from the barn roof. A soft, heavy slide. Thump. Both of them looked toward the sound. Nothing moved. Just winter settling its weight. Colt crossed the room. Lifted the rifle from beside the door. Checked the chamber. Steel clicked softly. The sound carried through the cabin like a bell. Elena watched him. You don't have to fight them. Colt set the rifle against the wall again. They haven't come yet. But they will. Yeah. The fire snapped again. Warmth rising stronger. But outside, the valley had woken. Somewhere beyond the ridge. More horses moved. Later that afternoon, the sound came clear. Hooves on frozen ground. Slow. Deliberate. Colt stepped onto the porch. The cold bit harder now. The sky gray and low. 3 riders approached through the snow. Coats dark. Hats low. Their horses breathing white clouds. The lead rider sat tall in the saddle. Not hurried. Not cautious. Like a man arriving at something he already owned. They stopped near the gate. The wind brushed across the yard. Snow whispering along the fence. The lead rider tipped his hat slightly. His voice carried across the cold afternoon. Colt did not move. What do you want? The rider smiled faintly. His eyes moved past Colt. Toward the cabin door. We're looking for someone. Colt's voice stayed flat. No one here but me. The rider leaned forward in his saddle. A small polished badge glinted beneath his coat. Not a sheriff. Something private. Something paid. His gaze drifted again toward the cabin window. And then he saw it. The whistle resting on the table behind the glass. Even from the yard. The dented metal caught the firelight. The rider's smile faded. Slowly. Recognition. Cold. Certain. He looked back at Colt. Well now. The snow creaked under his horse's hooves as it shifted. That's interesting. Inside the cabin, the whistle rolled once more against the wood. Click. And the warmth in the room suddenly felt very small. The riders stayed by the gate. 3 dark shapes against the white pasture. Their horses shifted in the snow. Leather creaked. Breath steamed in the cold air. Colt Harland stood on the porch. Boots planted. Hands loose at his sides. Behind him, the cabin door stayed closed. Firelight flickered faintly through the window. Warmth inside. Winter outside. The lead rider studied the house again. His eyes moved slowly across the porch. Across Colt. Then back toward the window. Toward the table inside. Toward the small dented whistle resting there. He smiled again. Not friendly. Just certain. Mind if we come closer? Colt shook his head once. Yeah, I mind. The rider chuckled softly. The sound carried strangely across the snow. You're Colt Harland, right? Colt said nothing. The rider nudged his horse forward 2 slow steps. The animal's hooves crunched through the frost. My name's Marcus Cade. The name settled in the cold air. Heavy. Familiar. Colt had heard it before. Men like that didn't ride lonely ranch roads for nothing. Cade leaned slightly in his saddle. Word as you prefer, quiet. True. Then I'll keep this simple. The wind brushed across the yard. Fence wire hummed softly. Cade pointed with 2 fingers toward the cabin. There's a woman inside your house. Colt didn't blink. Lots of women in the world. She's carrying something that belongs to me. Colt's voice stayed flat. No one inside belongs to you. Cade's smile tightened. Behind him, one of the other riders shifted his coat. Metal glinted under the cloth. A pistol. The horse snorted. Cold breath spilling across the snow. Inside the cabin, a chair creaked faintly. Elena had moved. Colt heard it. So did Cade. The man's eyes flicked toward the door again. You're harboring a thief. No. Cade's head tilted slightly. You sure about that? Colt stepped down from the porch. Snow crunched under his boots. The cold bit harder away from the house. But he didn't stop walking until he stood halfway between the riders and the door. You done talking? Cade studied him. The silence stretched. The valley held its breath. Finally Cade sighed softly. Let's try this another way. He reached slowly into his coat. Colt's shoulders tightened. The other riders tensed. But Cade pulled out paper. Folded. Worn. He held it up between two fingers. Legal claim. The wind snapped the corner of the document. This land used to belong to a rancher named Walker. Colt said nothing. Cade continued. He had debts. Lost everything. Then a woman appeared in town carrying a cavalry whistle taken from a dead officer. His eyes lifted to Colt again. That whistle belongs to my company. Colt's voice stayed calm. Didn't know metal could belong to anyone. Cade smiled thinly. That particular one does. The wind rattled the loose porch board behind Colt. Tap. Pause. Tap again. Inside the cabin something bumped the table. The whistle. Click. Even through the closed door the small sound seemed to carry. Cade heard it. His eyes sharpened. There it is. Colt took one step forward. Snow crunching under his boot. You ain't coming inside. Cade studied him for a long moment. Then laughed quietly. Relax, Harland. I didn't come for a fight today. One of the riders shifted again. His horse stomped hard. Snow kicked up around its hooves. Cade turned his horse slowly. But he didn't leave yet. Instead he looked back once more. His voice softer now. Colder. That whistle is evidence. Belongs to the company that paid for the patrol it came from. Officer died protecting it. Colt said nothing. Cade's eyes drifted toward the cabin door again. If that woman inside keeps it. He paused. A long moment. Then she's claiming to know how he died. The words hung heavy in the frozen air. Colt understood now. Not theft. Witness. The most dangerous thing in the world. Cade tipped his hat again. Snow's thick today. But weather clears tomorrow. His horse turned toward the ridge. The other riders followed. Before leaving, Cade glanced once more at the cabin window. At the flicker of firelight inside. At the life growing warm behind those walls. Tomorrow we talk again. The horses moved away. Hooves striking the frozen ground. Slow. Unhurried. Confident. Colt stood in the yard until the riders disappeared over the hill. The wind crept back across the valley. Cold. Restless. He returned to the porch. The board creaked beneath his boot. Inside the cabin the fire still burned bright. Warm light spilling across the table. Elena stood beside it. One hand resting on the chair. The other gripping the whistle. The cord wrapped tight around her wrist. Her face pale. You know who that was? Colt closed the door behind him. The latch clicked heavy. Yeah. The fire snapped loudly. A burst of sparks leapt up the chimney. Elena looked down at the whistle. Her thumb traced the dented metal again. He won't stop. No. The warmth of the room pressed against the cold clinging to Colt's coat. He leaned the rifle beside the table. Steel tapping wood. The sound carried through the quiet cabin. Then the whistle rolled softly in Elena's hand. Click. And both of them understood. Tomorrow would not be quiet. Night came early under the winter clouds. The valley darkened before the sun had fully gone. Cold pressed hard against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned steady. Logs shifting. Flames licking the iron stove. Warmth breathing through the small room. Elena sat near the table. Her shawl pulled close. The dented cavalry whistle rested in her palm. Its cord looped twice around her wrist. Click. It tapped softly against the wood when her hand trembled. Colt Harland stood by the window, watching the black yard beyond the frost. The snow reflected faint starlight. The ranch looked empty. Too empty. "You should sleep." Elena shook her head. "I won't. You'll need strength." "So will you." Colt said nothing. He moved to the door. Checked the latch. Solid. Then he lifted the rifle from the wall. Steel clicked softly as he worked the bolt. The sound carried through the quiet room like a warning bell. Elena listened. The fire cracked louder. Outside, the wind moved low across the snow. A slow whisper through the fence wire. Hours passed like that. Silence inside. Cold outside. The fire burned low. Colt added another log. Flames climbed again. Warm light pushing the shadows back. Elena watched him. "You've done this before." "Done what?" "Wait for trouble." Colt's voice stayed flat. "Trouble always comes." Her eyes lowered. Her thumb traced the dent on the whistle again. Click. The metal knocked softly against the table. Marcus Cade. The name hung in the air. Heavy. Colt looked at her. "You know him?" "I know what he did." The fire popped sharply. A log shifted under the heat. Elena's voice grew quieter. "That whistle belonged to a cavalry officer. Captain Daniel Rourke." Colt listened. Said nothing. He was escorting settlers north. Cade's men rode with them. Her fingers tightened around the whistle. They called it protection. But it was land theft. Cold slipped under the cabin door. The fire fought it back. Elena continued. "Rourke found out. He tried to stop them." Her voice broke slightly. "They shot him." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to lower its voice. Colt leaned against the wall. "And you saw?" Elena nodded slowly. "I was traveling with the wagon train. They thought everyone died when the wagons burned." Her hand lifted the whistle. "I took this before I ran." The dented metal caught the firelight. A small scar from the night a man died. Colt's eyes narrowed. "That's why Cade wants it." "Yes." The wind outside shifted. A loose board rattled on the porch. Tap. Pause. Tap again. Elena flinched. Colt moved to the window. His breath fogged the glass. At first he saw nothing. Then movement. 3 shadows near the barn. Horses. Colt stepped back from the window. "They're here." Elena's hand tightened around the whistle. Her chair scraped the floor as she stood. "Already?" "Yeah." Outside, the snow creaked under hooves. Slow. Deliberate. A man laughed softly in the dark. Another voice answered. Colt blew out the lantern by the window. The room dimmed. Only the stove light remained. Warm orange glow against the cold night. Elena whispered. "You could still send me out the back." Colt shook his head. "Too late." Boots crunched on the porch now. One step. Then another. The wood groaned under weight. A fist struck the door. Hard. The sound thundered through the cabin. Elena gasped. Colt didn't move. The knock came again. Louder. Harland. Marcus Cade's voice. Calm. Certain. "We know she's in there." The wind died outside. The world listening. Colt lifted the rifle slowly. The wood stock warm in his hands. Elena stood behind him. Her breath quick. The whistle pressed tight in her palm. Cade spoke again through the door. "You hand her over. And we ride away." Silence filled the cabin. The fire popped once. A single ember floated up the chimney. Elena whispered. "You don't owe me this." Colt kept his eyes on the door. "Maybe not. The porch board creaked as someone shifted weight outside. Leather rustled. A pistol hammer clicked. Colt waited on the other side of the door. Colt spoke quietly, but the words carried. "No room here." A pause outside. Then Cade laughed softly. "Then we'll make some." Snow fell lightly again. Soft white dust drifting through the dark yard. Inside the cabin the warmth held. For one more moment. Before the storm broke, the fist struck the door again. Wood shuddered in the frame. Cold pressed through the cracks like breath from a grave. Inside the cabin the stove burned hot. Logs snapping. Iron ticking. Warmth fighting the night. Colt Harland stood one step from the door. Rifle steady in his hands. Elena behind him. Her breath quick. The whistle clenched tight in her fist. Outside boots shifted on the porch. Snow creaked under weight. Marcus Cade spoke again. "You don't want this trouble, Harland." Colt said nothing. The silence stretched. Fire cracked behind him. Warmth on his back. Cold waiting on the other side of the wood. Cade sighed softly. Then the porch boards groaned as he stepped closer. Last chance. The latch rattled. Hard. Testing. Colt lifted the rifle higher. His voice low. "Step back." For a moment nothing moved. Then Cade laughed. A short sound. Sharp. "Boys." Boots shuffled outside. Metal scraped leather. Someone cocked a revolver. The hammer click cut through the quiet cabin like a nail through glass. Elena's fingers tightened around the whistle. Click. It tapped softly against the table edge. Colt heard it. The small sound steadied him. He took one step back from the door. Then another. His boot nudged the table leg. The whistle rolled slightly in Elena's hand. Outside a man slammed his shoulder into the door. Wood cracked. The frame jumped. The fire flared suddenly in the stove. Sparks leapt upward. Elena gasped. Colt spoke without turning. "Back corner." She moved quickly. Chair scraping across the floor. Blanket falling from her shoulders. The whistle still wrapped tight around her wrist. Another slam hit the door. Harder. The latch strained. Snow blew through the cracks. Cold wind tearing into the warm room. Cade's voice came low now. "You break it." The third hit split the wood. The door burst inward. Cold air roared through the cabin. Snow swirled across the floorboards. 3 men pushed inside. Coats black with frost. Pistols drawn. For one heartbeat the world froze. Warm firelight. Cold steel. Breath hanging in the air. Then Colt fired. The rifle cracked like thunder in the small room. The sound slammed against the walls. One man dropped instantly. His pistol clattered across the floor. Metal ringing loud against the boards. The second rider fired back. Glass shattered as the bullet ripped through the window. Cold wind howled through the opening. Elena ducked behind the table. The whistle knocked against the wood. Click. Colt worked the rifle bolt. Steel snapping fast. Another shot exploded. The second rider stumbled backward into the doorframe. Blood dark against the snow outside. Silence crashed into the cabin. Just the fire popping. And the wind screaming through the broken door. Marcus Cade stepped through the smoke. Slow. Calm. His pistol steady in his hand. 2 men down behind him. But the smile never left his face. "You always were stubborn." Colt aimed the rifle again. "Drop it." Cade's eyes flicked toward Elena, toward the whistle glinting in the firelight. Funny thing about truth. He moved one step closer. Men kill faster to hide it. Colt fired. Cade twisted sideways. The bullet tore through the doorframe instead. Wood splintered. Cade fired back. The shot blasted into the stovepipe. Iron rang like a bell. Hot sparks burst into the room. Elena cried out. The fire roared suddenly. Flames licking higher. Smoke curling toward the ceiling. Colt dropped the empty rifle. Grabbed the revolver from his belt. The sound of the hammer pulling back echoed in the smoky cabin. Cade raised his pistol again. Two men facing each other across the wrecked room. Warm firelight. Cold night wind. Elena crouched behind the table. Her hand shaking around the whistle. Cade glanced toward her. Just once. That moment was enough. Colt fired. The shot slammed through Cade's shoulder. The man staggered back. His pistol dropped into the snow outside the door. Silence returned. Heavy. Broken. Cade leaned against the porch rail. Blood soaking into the white ground. He looked up at Colt. Still smiling faintly. You think this ends it? Colt stepped onto the porch. Cold air biting his lungs. It ends tonight. Cade coughed once. Snowflakes drifted slowly between them. That whistle. His voice weaker now. We'll hang you both. Colt's revolver stayed steady. Behind him inside the cabin the fire crackled loud again. Warmth pushing back the cold. Elena stepped into the doorway. The whistle still in her hand. Its dented metal glowed faintly in the firelight. Cade saw it. His smile faded at last. Then Colt fired one final shot. The sound rolled across the frozen valley. And the night finally went quiet. Dawn came slow over the valley. Gray light touched the snow first. Then the barn roof. Then the broken porch. The night's cold still clung to everything. 3 bodies lay where the storm of gunfire had ended. Snow had already begun to soften the blood. Colt Harland stood in the yard. Breath wide in the air. Revolver low at his side. The silence after violence felt heavy. Not peaceful. Just empty. Behind him the cabin door creaked open. Warm firelight spilled across the snow. Elena stepped out carefully. Blanket around her shoulders. One hand pressed against the doorframe. The other holding the dented cavalry whistle. Click. It brushed softly against the wood. Colt glanced back. You should stay inside. I needed air. Her voice came quiet. The cold bit her cheeks instantly. Colt turned toward the bodies. Marcus Cade lay nearest the porch. Snow settling across his coat. The smile gone from his face. Elena looked once. Then looked away. The valley held a strange stillness. No wind. No birds. Just the quiet sound of melting frost sliding off the barn roof. Colt crouched beside Cade. Checked the pistol lying half buried in snow. Empty now. He stood again. Won't be long before someone comes looking. Elena nodded. They always do. The whistle rolled slowly in her hand. Click. Colt heard it again. The small broken rhythm. He looked at her. That thing started all this. Yes. She stepped closer to the porch rail. Snow crunched under her boots. Her eyes stayed on the whistle. For years I thought it was only proof. Colt waited. She lifted the metal piece slowly. The dented body caught the pale morning light. There's more. Colt frowned. Elena turned the whistle in her fingers. Her thumb pressed against the crack near the mouthpiece. A small seam opened. Hidden. The metal split slightly along the dent. Colt leaned closer. Inside the whistle sat something folded tight. Paper. Thin. Protected. Elena pulled it free carefully. The paper crackled in the cold air. Old. But still whole. Colt watched her unfold it. Ink lines spread across the page. Names. Dates. Coordinates. A map. Elena's voice lowered. Captain Rourke knew what Cade was doing. Land seizures. Burned wagon trains. False deeds. Her finger traced one name after another. Witnesses. settlers, soldiers. All recorded. Colt looked at the paper again. This proves it. Yes. The whole thing. Elena folded the paper carefully. The fire inside the cabin popped loudly behind them. Warmth drifting through the doorway. She slid the paper back inside the whistle. The dent closed over it again. Hidden once more. Click. The sound echoed softly. Colt looked toward the hills. Morning light now touching the ridge. We take that to town. Elena shook her head slowly. Gade's men control the town. Then somewhere else. They'll chase us. Colt studied the snowfield. Tracks from the fight still fresh. Blood bright against the white. They were already chasing you. Silence settled again. The kind that comes after truth. Elena stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath her weight. The cabin warmth wrapped around her shoulders again. She looked back toward Colt. You still have time to walk away. Colt stepped onto the porch too. Boots thudding heavy against the wood. Don't work that way. The whistle rested in Elena's palm again. Its cord still wrapped around her wrist. Why help me? Colt leaned against the doorframe. The fire crackled behind him. Man spends too long alone. Starts forgetting what right looks like. Elena studied him. Then nodded once. Inside the cabin the fire burned stronger. Snow began melting from the porch roof. Drops falling steadily to the ground. Cold turning slowly to water. Elena lifted the whistle to her lips. Blew gently. The sound came thin. Still broken. But clearer now. A faint trembling note carried into the morning air. Colt listened. The valley answered with silence. But this time the silence felt different. Not empty. Waiting. Somewhere beyond the ridge. Justice still slept. But it would wake. And the truth now had a voice. Even if it came from a cracked old whistle. Spring came slowly to the valley. Snow retreated from the fence lines first. Then the hilltops. Then the long pasture behind the barn. Cold loosened its grip day by day. Water ran through the dry creek again. The ranch breathed differently now. Warmer. Alive. Colt Harland stood near the fence post with a hammer in his hand. Iron rang against nail. Clang. Wood settled into place. The repaired board held firm. Behind him the barn door creaked open. Elena stepped out into the morning sun. Her steps slower now. Careful. But steady. The blanket around her shoulders had been replaced with a thick shawl. And beneath it the round curve of her belly showed clearly. Life growing. The wind carried the smell of grass. Warm earth. The kind of smell that belonged to mornings without fear. Inside the cabin a kettle rattled softly on the stove. Water beginning to sing. Elena paused halfway across the yard. Listening. The quiet felt peaceful. But the memory of winter still lingered. Sometimes the wind still sounded like distant hooves. Sometimes the silence felt too deep. Colt noticed her pause. You hear something? Elena shook her head. Just remembering. He drove the final nail into the fence. Clang. The sound rang across the valley. Nothing answered. No riders. No shadows on the ridge. Only birds moving through the sky again. Elena exhaled slowly. Months had passed since the night of gunfire. The sheriff from the next county had come. So had 2 federal riders. They listened. They read the paper hidden inside the whistle. The names. The map. The proof. Marcus Cade's empire cracked open like rotten wood. His men scattered. Some ran. Some hung. Justice moves slowly in these lands. But it had moved. Elena reached the porch. The boards creaked gently beneath her boots. Inside the cabin the fire burned lower now. Spring warmth replacing winter flame. She stepped to the doorway and lifted the small object hanging beside it. The dented cavalry whistle. Its cord tied neatly to a nail in the doorframe. The metal caught the sunlight. Its dent still there. Its scar still visible. But the whistle no longer hid secrets. The folded paper now lives safely inside the sheriff's office. The truth carried beyond this valley. Still, Elena kept the whistle. She lifted it gently. Turned it in her fingers. Click. The soft metal sound echoed against the porch post. Colt heard it. He walked toward the cabin slowly. Boots brushing the grass. "You're thinking again." Elena smiled faintly. "I always am." She lifted the whistle toward her lips. "Still broken?" "Maybe." Colt leaned against the porch rail. Sunlight warmed the wood. Birds rustled in the cottonwood trees nearby. Elena blew softly. The whistle answered. A thin trembling note. Not sharp. Not strong. But clear enough to carry across the yard. The sound drifted over the grass. Light. Gentle. Almost playful. Colt tilted his head. "That's better." Elena lowered the whistle. The crack changed the tone. "Yeah." She tied the cord back around the nail by the door. Let it hang where the wind could reach it. A breeze moved through the valley. Soft. Warm. The whistle turned slightly. Then it sang again. A small wandering trill. Not a call for danger now. Just a quiet note carried by the morning air. From inside the cabin came another sound. A small cry. Sharp. New. Both of them turned instantly. Elena laughed softly. The sound filled the porch. Warm. Alive. Colt stepped aside as she moved inside. The floorboards creaked under her careful steps. Inside the room the cradle rocked gently near the window. Blankets stuck tight around a small red face. The baby squirmed. Tiny hands pushing at the air. Elena lifted the child slowly. The room glowed with soft sunlight. Warmth filled every corner. Colt stood near the doorway. Watching. Quiet. The baby settled against Elena's shoulder. The small cries faded. Only soft breathing now. Outside the breeze moved again. The whistle by the door gave another gentle trill. A wandering note across the ranch. Elena looked up. He hears it. Colt glanced at the baby. The tiny eyes blinking slowly. Maybe he likes the sound. Elena smiled. Maybe he knows what it means. What's that? She looked toward the door. Toward the small piece of dented metal swaying in the light. That someone stood their ground. Colt nodded once. The whistle sang again in the breeze. Soft. Steady. No longer a warning. Just a memory carried through warm spring air. And the ranch. Once silent. Once cold. Now held something different. The sound of life continuing. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend. Keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.